drawing the exact same conclusions. But
I mean, I'm not saying you'd end up in the gulag. I mean,
yeah.
we'll see how the interview goes.
That's what everyone always says. That's what they always say.
That's how it starts, right?
And
That's
then
how it
and then
starts.
so you're staring down at your comrades like, what happened? So
Yeah. Well, I mean, like you shouldn't have wrote that line of poetry. Man.
yeah.
All right. We're joined this hour by David Lau. He is going to share some poem. He's going to share a poem with us. And hopefully, it doesn't end up in the Google.
um haha. Okay, this is up on the internet, and it's called Lunati Schema. And the Lunati Schema, my poetry's full of like a lot of collage, surrealist kind of culture jamming and mashups and stuff. And so the Lunati Schema is this thing uh, that was used by people to interpret James Joyce's Ulysses. So this is a little more prosy and kind of explanatory for my style of surrealist leftist poetry. Okay, Lunati Schema. Finally, a passage through the breaks deploys the self-protective rhetoric of an innovative present. Surprise, buoyed by sickness, we were somewhere in the ash cloud, stirred by paroxysms of a wounded Sunbelt hegemon. I had seen the edge of global shipping's blast radius. I wrote some songs for a woman leader about a world of new things. Marja is a citied village in Afghanistan, the site of American-led raids. Gypsy like this. Have I long? San Leandro don't have it going on like they have it here, she said, taking a break from the dance floor. Like icon. First line of urbanized unemployment, a classical one. Lost access to land as a consequence of the Green Revolution in agriculture. Some suggestion of war as an unfinished Hegelian line. Godard example had been a quotation from Dre, which is either intense or whispered. I don't know how Chris Daniels translated it. These dying, disappearing, becoming workers, peasants, support breathless. So Warren G's influence strange. Vast anime marathon a friend showed me. Some dominant painterly blue, when to outstrip thy skiey speed, scarce seemed an old problem in the countryside. These dying, disappearing, becoming workers, former peasants, support Prachanda, fierce one, Maoist leader of Nepal, where a recently established republic comes after a long armed struggle, the people's movement having displaced a monarchy. Text Mage, Part 2 Brecht, a Peaches Argonaut, Personnel Mart, whispered Chris Chen.
Yeah. Okay, so thank you, David. For those not
For sure, dude.
For those not familiar with some of the references in your poem, who is Chris Chen?
Chris Chen is a scholar and friend of mine. He writes basically on contemporary poetry and race. Mm-hmm. He teaches here at UC Santa Cruz, but we go back a long way. Yeah. So there's like lots of little collage effects in that book that I wrote. Some of these poems are from about 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. 10. That one has, it goes back probably 10 years. It was kind of written after a lot of study of the Maoist movement in Nepal.
Yeah.
Kind of from the tattered margins of a book kind of poem.
Yeah. No, it's great work. It's kind of reminded me a lot, actually, before we started rolling, we were talking a little bit about Jack Hirschman, and it kind of reminds me a lot of like Jack's work, where it's kind of like he gets into like the kind of the details of these struggles that he doesn't really care if the audience is familiar with or not. Just kind of following the poetic impulses with the familiarity he has with the information. No, it's good because it makes people look.
No, I like how Jack does that.
Yeah,
I like how his work is real dense with,
Yeah. No, and it leaps across time. Especially you're like in Romania in like the 60s, and if you don't understand like why she was crying at the cafe, that's your fault. Like you need to study.
If you don't know, you don't care.
Yeah, it's right. It's right.
Yeah.
You don't know, and now you know. Now you know.
Yeah, I like poetry that even in my own poetry, when I read it, it still makes me like think when I'm reading it. It like that's I like all kinds of different poetry, but in my own work,
Mhm.
I like that feeling like when I go back to it that it like kind of, oh, okay, I have to refamiliarize myself and think about what I was doing when I and stuff I was reading and trying to kind of embed in the poem. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, it's also kind of jazz. You know, I'm influenced by like jazz and improvisational music and just kind of forms of extemporaneous creativity.
Yeah.
Uh, so that influences kind of how the poems are put together too.
But in some ways, it's like a journal entry too. That you kind of you return to it, so you have to like know. You don't remember exactly what you were mad about 3 years ago, but you know
Right.
that you were mad. You can see.
No, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I like writing book reviews for similar reasons and stuff like that. Just, you know, a record of, yeah, like a kind of a journal entry, diary, notes, records of what you've been reading and your account of things.
Yeah. So on top of poet, you're also an essayist, and you were working on. You were telling me about some essays about a Marxist poet. Can you tell our audience a little bit about?
I'm just working on a couple of things. One is just an essay on a new book by Mark Nowak, who's a poet who came out of the labor movement in the 90s in the Midwest. And yeah, was like a kind of in the service workers sector of the labor movement, which is that's been a tough struggle. So he's been through a lot of ups and downs. These days he's in academia, but that was kind of like a later thing.
Yeah.
But he's published a few books with Coffee House Books, um, going back probably about 20 years now. And he, in the 90s, he edited a magazine called Cross Cultural Poetics. Nice kind of left wing and also left wing of multiculturalism
Yeah.
kind of magazine of that time.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, he was mentored by Amiri Baraka.
Cool. Wow.
He's a solid guy.
Yeah.
I don't know him personally, but we have a little bit of correspondence. But he
Yeah.
has a new book out called Social Poetics, his first book of essays of prose, though he's written essays over the years. And it kind of explores the idea of a people's writers workshop. So one example might be the Watts Writers Workshop.
Yeah. Yeah.
Kind of community-based arts, cultural centers, labor hall, you know, schools, prisons, places where writers' workshops are conducted that are not in this kind of, you know, academic setting, traditional academic setting. And then he looks at there's an essay in there where he looks at all these anthologies that were published kind of out of prison writers workshops or community based ones or like labor movement ones. He has an international um, treatment of the topic too. So he looks, for example, at Nicaragua.
Mm.
Before you came on break, you were bringing up Nicaragua, and
Yeah.
he looks at this famous book by the poet Kent Johnson called A Nation of Poets.
Okay.
And yeah, so there's a treatment of like Ernesto Cardenal's writers' workshops in revolutionary Nicaragua. So anyway, there's stuff about South Africa, and then his own experiences in the labor movement in the 90s,
Mm.
unionizing some bookstores in the upper Midwest, union campaigns around borders and stuff.
Wow. Yeah.
So anyway, I'm working on an analysis of the book, and then uh, yeah, trying to work on a criticism. You know, it's always hard to criticize another Marxist.
Yeah.
Most
Yeah.
of the time I write a book, most of the time I write a book criticism, it's kind of like, you know, it's a good book, but maybe
Yeah.
it wasn't like the correct line, you know. So
Right. Right. Right.
but this is like, so I have to work on a more I have to
Yeah,
work on a more nuanced criticism for this book,
yeah,
but it should be fun to write. I'm reading and taking notes and stuff like that. Other thing I'm working on is an essay on the politics of American poetry,
okay,
uh, and that's a complex topic. So
yeah.
I probably mean something more like the left wing politics,
So when you say the
or
politics of American poetry, are you talking about the politics that are expressed by the poets like worldview, or are you talking about the politics
yeah. So the
of,
content,
of poets,
and then also the politics of poetry
like who gets
itself.
published,
Yeah,
who doesn't, and who gets
exactly.
yeah,
So both of those, I'm
yeah,
gonna try to write about both of those things.
okay,
Yeah,
because
I mean some of it is yeah. So the field, there's a kind of field of contemporary poetry which has different sort of wings and segments, and then um yeah, it's a bit of a sprawling topic, honestly, and but I have some good like I'm gonna treat like Amiri Baraka's work of the last few decades, so
yeah.
like from the 90s to the present, so I have some like good things I'm gonna analyze.
Did you ever?
Like Amiri obviously wrote probably the most famous uh poem about 9/11, arguably the most well-known poem of the 21st century in the country. So
Yeah,
yeah, somebody blew up America. So,
yeah.
uh,
Somebody
and
blew
then
up.
that all kinds of national attention,
Yeah,
media attention, and then Amiri also had you know poems he wrote after that. He for instance backed the Obama
yeah,
run in 2008, and then later turned against Obama. So I'm gonna just kind of look at some figures, like look at
yeah,
Amiri's like later, look at Baraka's later political works and the kind of final phases of his career. But yeah, I think that there's an argument to be made about how the condition of global capitalism is creating common content for politically or publicly minded poetry.
hmm?
So there's like lots of response to like 9/11, the war in Iraq, the Obama administration, like this kind of global capitalist
yeah. I guess
unity of time and space and experiences.
yeah. Gives people a common frame
Um,
of reference.
exactly. So I think so. There's some kind of interpretive strategies I'm going to try to bring to bear
Yeah.
too.
So what?
Explanatory stuff.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's kind of like I basically I write like Marxist literary criticism,
Mhm.
somewhat arcane wing of Marxism, but that's my fate, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. Find a rock and push up the hill. So I'm curious though, because you referred to globalization, and I'm really interested in your opinion about what is the gray area, what is the nodal line, there's aspects of kind of a global world culture that have a lot to do with the arts and have a lot to do with communication, new technologies that allow us to talk to each other where distance is not a thing. But then the common frame of reference we have is totally rooted in the imperialist order of the world, right?
Hmm.
You and I are not sitting here with a common reference of Nigerian culture or Malaysian culture or Argentinian culture or any of that. We have but people in those countries would have some common reference of American culture because the U.S. is an empire, right? And it beams its culture all over the world.
Definitely.
So how much of this? I mean, so where how do these things interplay? Like the one aspect of this is that it's good, this global the possibility of global communication, which is good. Um, but the one-sidedness of it, which is based upon the imperial order of the world,
Mm.
not just one side. I mean, also British culture, even Japanese culture or French culture, beaming all over the world as well to a lesser extent. But again, based on imperialism.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I've been accused at times of being sort of old-fashioned and having ideas about like, proletarian groups and just composing and developing their own culture and modes of transmission and distribution. I
Mhm.
mean, I think we have to rely on the internet to some extent today, obviously, in ways that people didn't have to do it in the 60s.
Yeah.
But I sort of feel like capitalist media always just pushes, you know, a few marketable things, and you live in its shadow, or you try to build your own thing, develop your own book publishing and magazines, and um, yeah, because that otherwise you're just sort of lost in the in the culture of the empire.
Yeah.
For me, that's like a really crucial thing. And so I think that one has to have these kind of fundamental commitments. But obviously for a lot of people there's a lot of opportunism and just that sort of thing in academia, and you know,
Yeah.
in the media world, you know, people want to get their columns published here and there, and you know, and so yeah, people are willing to kind of try to ride the tiger
Yeah.
of the imperial media system. But I think we have to, like, in some sense, still do the harder work of building outside of it. And so to me, there's lots of legacies of the 60s, but the work that was done in kind of like, you know, the Asian American Chicano movement, Black struggle to like build book publishers, newspapers,
Mhm.
you know, also in the labor movement too,
Mhm.
you know, brought the newspaper publishing tradition. I'm somebody who used to edit for a long time the Union newsletter at Cabrillo College,
Yeah.
and used to write like a column for the Union newsletter, and still kind of do some of that at the place I teach now. Um, and so yeah, so I think that, you know, those kinds of infrastructures are really fundamentally important.
So you swim in a couple different rivers, and I'm kind of interested in this, because you are on the one hand you we talked about the politics of poetry, right? But there's definitely there's that, and there's theft, there's this, there's that, there's mutual support, there's wings, there's people who gather together on the basis of a shared politics about the world, and so they kind of gather within poetry and kind of move as a group, or this group and that.
Mm-hmm.
But those exact same phenomenons happen in academia, though they happen a little differently. So, could you speak a little different about how do the politics of poetry, within poetry, and academia, how are they similar? How are they dissimilar?
Um, hmm. Well, I think that well, it's almost like in a lot of ways today, what's happened is in poetry is that there's been, I mean, I did an interview a while back with Juan Felipe Herrera, that's up on the Poetry Foundation website, and basically, Juan Felipe makes this point that there's been a wholesale entry of um, writers of color into like kind of the AWP world
Mhm.
of MFA programs and academic teaching jobs, and that historically that's, you know, that's kind of occurred. And so in a lot of ways the poetry politics that play out in some regards are, yeah, it's kind of integrated into academic politics. It's a little bit different. I mean, obviously both are trend oriented, you know. I mean, there's it's a little bit different, you know.
Yeah,
There, in academia there's I don't know. It's hard. It's
it's
hard to
hard.
say. It's like, is there more or less at stake? I'm not
Yeah,
sure. But
there's more money,
the
but
institutions are obviously academics. The institutions are um, have power, and so if you have institutional positions, and that's some of that's true in the obviously in the literary world too. But I
yeah,
think that, you know, compared to also I feel like younger people, they know about poets who are like teachers or academics
hmm
more so than someone like Jack Hirschman, or you know, who came out of the older world
yeah,
of urban culture and poetry performance, and
yeah,
yeah. So, um, but it seems to me that they have a lot in common these days.
yeah, yeah. No, I mean, like, there's I don't know. It's, anytime you get people in these conversations, they always talk about the negative aspects of things like theft, like egos, and like gatekeeping and all of that. But there's also a lot of positive aspects as well. I mean, You know, I mean, it's my natural inclination to start talking about like, watching people in poetry, well, because I skirt I skirt the outskirts of academia, right? I'm always on the outskirts of it. I jump in and jump out, jump in, jump out, right? And oftentimes I'm able to jump in at levels that people are like, who let him in here? But I just I'm clever.
Right.
So, like so, but
I mean, definitely, I think that you know, at one time, the more alternative poetic cultures would have thought academia was, and that's really changed.
yeah,
That's fundamentally different now. Like the alternative poetic cultures are academic.
yeah,
They have all the same kind of academic dynamics that go on in connection with them. And I like the community college, and I know you do performances at the community college. I like the community college as an academic setting,
yeah,
as a way to kind of keep it a little more real.
yeah.
Um, and always have to be kind of on your toes, cracking your head against other young people's heads, and people who don't have the academic experiences that I had,
Mhm.
you
Well,
know,
the reason
growing up and stuff.
I enjoy the community colleges so much more. It's not necessarily because of the English departments there. The English departments there versus the English departments somewhere else. They kind of like vary, but it's actually the rest of the humanities that tend to be on like a 4-year prestigious campus versus the humanities on a community college. Because the humanities there, the community college, much more grounded, much more down to earth, much more trying to explain to working class students how to kind of understand the world around them and give them some like kind of philosophical tools
For sure.
that can be applied to the world. When you start going to those 4 years, those people have to justify why they're making like $200,000 a year. So they're just making up bizarre, jargonistic. I don't know. This is all me. This is not you. So I won't get in any like trouble.
It's fine.
This is all
It's
me.
fine. Yeah.
A bunch of bizarre jargon that's like stringed together opportunistically with the same logic as Scrabble. You try to score points, so you're like putting these words together that don't necessarily connect. And that's kind of how I feel about most of the sociology departments. And so that ends up infecting the entire campus culture. So that you get there and someone's like, why do you capitalize words in your poems? Like, why is the beginning line capitalized? That's not right. That's like offensive. Like, I don't have time for that. And
Right.
so I'd rather be on the community campus. I'd rather be on community college campuses because the culture of community college campuses is much more something I'm much more comfortable with, something I've much more been around. And honestly, like when I do appear at college campuses and stuff like that, I'm not here to be criticized. You know what I mean? I'm here to be like praised, studied. Like learn from me. Don't
Yeah.
listen to like
No, seriously. Yeah.
no, I mean, yes. I mean, it depends. It depends on the setting. I mean, I'm joking and I'm not, but, uh, but so for me, that's why I prefer the community campuses because it's much more. They're just much more interesting because it's much less when you start getting higher and higher realms, it's almost becomes like this weird thing where people feel as if they can poke a hole in something you produced, they are somehow greater than your production, having produced nothing themselves. And I just don't have any, even like you're talking about writing criticism, right? That's like an essay. That's actually production. I'm talking about just sitting there making a little argument and then like feeling like good about yourself. And I just don't have time.
Right.
I don't have time for that on campus. I don't have time for that on the internet. I don't have time for that. like,
No, I mean, even when I write criticism, I always try to do something really substantive on the whole person's whole view of stuff, and you know,
and then you're
so that
comparing.
if I do have a criticism, they might actually listen to me and not,
Yeah.
you know, just think I'm shooting from the hip at trying to poke holes and stuff. Yeah.
And then you're drawing from other people, other worldviews, other people's work, and then putting in reference. You place their work in a
Right.
world, right? So that's work itself. Placing someone else's work in a world is
Right.
is work. So that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about just the. But so that's why I prefer the community campuses because community college campuses it happens far less. Which is not to say that people in community college campuses don't have like a lot of insights as well. They just don't have the attitude as though if I go here and embarrass the guy standing in front of everybody, I will have had a good day. I will have accomplished something.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's hard to. I mean, I try to stay positive mostly about the academia and poetry world stuff, but yeah, there is a lot of that. There's a lot of that goes on. Um, but now, yeah, now is a crazy time. So who knows what poetry and these kinds of fields will look like in the coming decade.
Yeah. So you,
Academia really benefited from the quote unquote recovery from the financial crisis. You
mm,
know, I mean, academia really, it got a lot of new enrollments and international students and like student loan money and yeah, it's really hard to say where the economic situation is going to be like 2 3 years from now. So,
see
but
earlier.
that there could be some silver linings there too.
So earlier you
So
mentioned all this kind of poetic flourishing, political poetic flourishing coming out of the African American liberation struggle, coming out of Chicanos, and you also mentioned Asian American presses. It would be really, or Asian American organizations and presses.
right,
And so we've had a lot of Chicanos on here. We've had a lot of African Americans, but we really haven't had too many specifically Asian American authors and writers and thinkers to tell us about this kind of history. So could you share with our audience specifically some of the Asian American movements and things that came out of that time period?
well, I could try, dude. I mean, uh well, first I should just say that my family is from Mexico. My dad's from Mexico, but we're from the Chinese immigrant community into Mexico. And so in some ways, yeah, I think I've been talked about as an Asian American poet, um, and that's probably true. But I also feel pretty connected to that other struggle too. And I
Mhm.
have my family's basically a big Mexican family in a lot of ways.
Right.
But um, uh, yeah, I mean, so I had a colleague at Cabrillo College, and he was part of a generation of Asian American poets. This guy named Jeff Tagami, great proletarian kind of poet. He was part of a generation of Asian American poets in the Bay Area who, many of whom were Filipino, like Al Robles, and they were San Francisco rooted. Kearney Street Workshop.
Mhm.
That was like that was the 70s, 80s. A lot of books came out of that famous hotbed of Asian American writing. I had a colleague here at UC Santa Cruz named Karen Yamashita, and Karen's sometimes thought of as an LA writer, but she wrote a book about the I Hotel, and um, I have this other friend and colleague Seshu Foster, who also kind of comes out of that nexus of Chicano and Asian American LA.
Yeah. So
So he and I are kind of friendly in this sort of way. And so anyway, but Seshu, there's a good press in LA called Kaya Press that put out Seshu's couple of Seshu's books of poetry, and that's an Asian American poetry press that's been going for a long time. Um, so yeah, I mean it's West Coast. My familiarity with the Asian American writers is a West Coast dynamic, but yeah, there's been some controversy too, I guess, around various things with Asian American radical movements and that sort of thing too. There was a good book written a while ago. It's what's it over here? It's called "Serve the People,"
Mhm.
a verso book. If people wanted to get more background, like in the kind of history of movements, but obviously, at some taproot level, the Filipino struggle was really close to the Chicano struggle, especially in the fields,
Of course.
and in the so like my old colleague Jeff Tagami at Cabrillo College. Jeff died some years ago of cancer, but uh, he grew up in a farm worker family in
Yeah.
Watsonville, and so there's still that kind of uh, that legacy there.
Yeah.
In our area, one thing that's changed a lot is obviously Mexican migration to
Yeah.
the U.S. since like the 60s and 70s. There's been a huge wave. So now California is so much more Mexicanized than it even was 2 generations ago, like when my dad was growing up or when your parents were growing up or whatever, right? So
But within my
um,
within our lifetimes, we've seen
within our lifetimes, exactly. Yeah.
we've seen the state get
Yeah.
much more. Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh,
So the last 30 years, things have changed a lot. I um, I collaborated with there's a radical uh, young poet, Asian American poet I collaborated with over the years. This guy named Brian Ang. People might be interested in his work. He did a magazine that you can find on a old Blogspot account called Armed Cell,
mhm.
and I used to write for that. And Brian's an interesting guy. Yeah, sorry, dude. I think that Asian American rat, yeah, the rat, some elements of it have become famous and much more mainstream. And now, you see Asian American writers and poets who are among the most mainstream of all writers and poets and that sort of thing. But I think there's also like a kind of legacy of a more radical thing there too.
Yeah.
And so
Well,
I feel somewhat connected to that. I mean, in fact, I guess I would just say biographically, um, like Karen Yamashita, for example, when she hired me at UC Santa Cruz years and years ago, I mean, definitely the fact that I was I had radical views and a kind of surrealist aesthetic and was an Asian American person, that definitely it meant that we connected. And
yeah.
so there's a legacy of older people who I've been able to connect to, and that's been important for me. Seshu, Karen, um, and then it makes it feel like it's something you gotta try to uphold.
Yeah.
My friend Chris Chen, we were talking about before, some years ago, Chris organized a reading at Berkeley called Asian American Poetry Now, and I participated in that with Sering Wangpo Dopa and Barbara Jane Reyes and this some people came from the East Coast, like this Filipino writer Paulo Javier, and so there've been things at times too where I've been in contexts where it's organized as a field, and I kind of see other Asian American writers doing something that I'm interested in, and yeah, um,
So we did a show one time, me and a few other people, and we combined some like lecture with poetry with storytelling and also for that, and it was a really it was a good show. I mean, I'm proud of it that we put on. But at the end, the audience started clapping, and then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, the normal clap turned into the kind of what's most what a lot of people know is the Mecha unity clap, right? But that Mecha like actually started in the fields with the UFW, but it didn't actually start with the Chicanos.
mm,
It began with the Filipinos and
mm,
on Baksak, right? The one up, one down, or I don't remember the exact
mm-hmm,
translation, but that is carried through to the Chicano culture. So it's definitely a melding
for
of
sure.
West Coast life. And Seshu himself, I mean, I've done a few shows with Seshu, and I know he's really kind of this great poet of City Terrace, right? That is that area of the East Side that kind of overlooks, kind of on a hill, overlooks the area. But like I actually, I was baptized in a church in City Terrace because I'm originally from Osoreno, which is like the neighboring city. So
Uh-huh.
um,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
it's like it's all that you say. It's definitely it's a West Coast.
Yeah.
If you're not from here, you won't understand. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like the San Gabriel Valley and these parts of Southern Cal, like where my parents now live in North Orange County.
Mm.
It's like this just insane. Uh, like if you drop just random Middle Americans off on a corner, you know, they'd they'd have no idea what's going on. There's so many different communities, and yeah, so
Yeah.
yeah, definitely. that all that stuff is normal.
Yeah, yeah.
If you're from the West Coast, if you come from like a big diverse Mexican family,
Mhm.
so. But yeah, I think it's funny how in some ways the older infrastructure of what I would think of as the left-wing heyday of like multicultural movement politics and stuff, the old infrastructure is still kind of there. And for me, that's the idea,
Yeah.
that you have a press, newspapers, that the labor, everything is kind of like energizing a labor movement, you know, and yeah, it's just a weird time right now. I feel like it's a very weird time right now because so many of the operating ideas uh, are being scrambled by the
Yeah.
fact that we're dealing with this crazy pandemic, and it's like a world historical change and stuff.
Well,
But yeah, I'm basically a labor movement kind of person
let,
too.
yeah, let's get into some hard politics then. I mean, all this artsy fartsy poetry shit. Let's get. But no,
That's what I'm saying. Let's just rap about.
let's rap about it, man. Okay, so
Yeah.
why do you think it is? Why is it that a capitalist economy that's based on a market system cannot produce the necessary life-saving items in this global pandemic? Why don't we have ventilators? Why don't we have masks? Why don't we have gloves? Why don't we have enough?
Well, I mean, you just don't. Um, you have basically the American medical system isn't really a public system. It is that market system in some regards with its various corrupt dimensions and like all markets, and bully actors. And so I think in some ways it's attributable to the fact that we lack such a, if you have a million little private doctors, with all of their market interests, basically you don't have the ability to coordinate a national healthcare system that can provide masks and ventilators, where needed, when needed. And you have doctors, maybe well-meaning people, maybe not, but they're also just like a small business looking out for how they're going to survive.
Yeah, trying to
So
stay.
you can't. That's the system they're inserted into too. And so but I think it definitely is the market in some ways that you can. I was reading a thing yesterday. I don't know if you saw this, that there's all this carbon dioxide shortage, and then it's like, well, why is there a carbon dioxide like canned gas that's used to, like, say, carbonate sodas or beers on an industrial scale? The production of it has collapsed, and some of it has to do with
It's gone
the
flat.
collapse of the oil markets,
Okay.
and all of these attendant ethanol product markets,
Yeah.
and then a bunch of the ethanol plants, they produce gas. And so because all these plants are shut down because of all these market failures, and then you need like carbonation to like purify water, like drinking water for cities and stuff. So it could be a big, 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 big dimension that's going to emerge pretty quickly.
See, a capitalist
Just
economy.
one cascading market failure after
Yeah,
another. Just,
yeah.
you know,
A capitalist economy is kind of like a skyscraper built of popsicle sticks. I mean, like it's there, but like this thing could easily
well,
collapse.
especially this financialized form of it.
Yeah,
The one that we're also familiar with now, where you got everyone working in services, and you got money changing hands through trading and stock buybacks and zero interest rates, and just more, if you have capital, it's like impossible not to make money.
so where did
uh
what happened to industrial era Fordism? Where'd it go? Why is it going?
um oh man, how long do we have?
Uh,
I well, some of obviously, other parts of the world are industrialized in the period in which the United States is deindustrialized. So I think there's two sides of that story. So, Mexican industrialization along the border zone, and obviously East Asia, Taiwan, South Korea, um, Japan, China, eventually all industrial, and so some of it is explained in that regard. I do think that it's probably still understated how many industrial jobs there are in what Marx would have considered um, jobs that are involved in the circuit of capital accumulation fundamentally, like delivery jobs and warehousing jobs. All of that was for him part of the productive circuit of, it was how the value of the commodity got realized. It had to be delivered, it had to be warehoused, it had to be. So all of that. So I think that still there's probably not enough emphasis put on industrial work and that. But yeah, obviously a lot more people work in services. That's also true.
Yeah.
So some of it's just response to the crisis of the 70s. Isn't that the standard story?
It is.
I don't. I studied a lot of this stuff, and I studied a lot of this stuff and read a lot of that guy Robert Brenner,
Uh-huh.
who was a professor of mine once upon a time when I was an undergrad at
Yeah.
UCLA. And Brenner's this famous Marxist who writes about the long downturn.
Yeah. Well, there's a guy named Martin Ford who wrote a book called. I mean, he's not a Marxist at all, but he just studies technology. He wrote about like the end of it's called Light at the End of the Tunnel. He wrote a lot about like automation and that, and then of course there's what Jeremy Rifkin wrote the end of
Right.
and I really think that has a lot more to do with it than some neoliberal turn or Ronald Reagan or some type of these political machinations. Like the mechanization, the automation, and mechanization's always been part of. I mean, the Industrial Revolution is mechanization, but um, this new level, like the computer network control, the machines that can build machines, that can build machines, that can build machines. I don't think it enters into the I don't think it enters into the means of production and then destroys everything immediately. But I think we've been witnessing like a 40-50 year process that has happened within my lifetime, that creates a system where people are being further and further pushed out of um, people who are intended to produce and then buy the commodity. I labored on this commodity, now I buy the commodity. That kind of system has been broken. Now we have people laboring in different parts of the world, and they're never meant to pay that price for that commodity. So it's a weird dynamic that's going now, but I think it's on its way towards something else. And I
Right. Job killing automation. Yeah. I mean, I guess I agree, and I am also sympathetic to the other view that, in a way, the job killing dynamic comes primarily from overproduction on a global scale.
yeah.
And so, but then you're right to say that, yes, there are also these near term, and we've lived through them, advances in robotics and automation that are having effects on employment too. There's an article by an old friend of mine in a recent issue of the New Left Review.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually a really long series of articles, but it's called Automation Discourse.
Yeah.
And the younger scholar named Aaron Benenev. And Aaron criticizes the idea, like in Rifkin and others, that the source of contemporary joblessness and like declining employment is in the automation. He says that no, instead it's in the basic dynamics of overproduction at a global scale.
Yeah.
So there's just way more capacity and more ability to produce goods than there are the ability to consume, and yeah, so there's not hiring has slowed down because of that dynamic and joblessness. But then yes, at the same time, anyway, so I that essay, I learned a bunch from the first part of that essay.
Well, please,
It's in two
yeah,
parts.
please send it to me. Please send it to me. I'd love
For
to.
sure. I can totally send it. It gets right at this question. But to me, yeah, the bigger dynamic is still there. Like and then the question you could say is like, what's the labor movement response?
Well, I mean,
and what to do about, obviously you have to still fight to organize workplaces, whether they're Amazon warehouses or restaurants and bars and hotels and schools and whatever else. So I still I think that sometimes the analysis uh, it loses that question of like the organizational politics.
I think that there are things that are theoretical, and maybe this, maybe that, and we don't know, and you cannot put life as lived in the moment in a petri dish and experiment in that kind of way. So that there's these questions of that are worth debating. But then there's what's observable, and there's what's obvious. And what's obvious is that the threat of automation hangs over labor struggles all throughout the United States at the very least. I mean, the fact of the matter is that during the Fight for 15, the CEO of Carl's Jr. and Hardee's, he essentially said, "I will automate. Like if you keep this up, I will automate. Period." And that kind of threat exists with that. That kind of threat exists over the teachers when they do things, bringing in the MOOC, the thing called the MOOC, where it's like it's
Oh,
like
for sure. Yeah.
that the threat of high of more machines,
Yeah.
less human beings, exists over all the labor struggles in the United States of America, and that is without question. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah. No, I mean, definitely you're right to say. I think still it's a little it it is like they're like a threat, and then can they really do it is maybe a little different because the kind of investment that's required, and then we live in this heavily indebted, crapped out form of kind of bailout capitalism. But it's the technologies are also getting cheaper. So it's not like it would necessarily require the same levels of investment that maybe it would have 20, 30 years ago.
Right.
I've been teaching a class at UC Santa Cruz on and off over the years called Culture After Google. And so we were looking at some of these questions about like how much AI is advancing. And then I've a couple of years ago, I taught some engineering students in this class, and they were schooling me with just how rapidly computer processing and this sort of stuff is changing. So yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
but yeah, I mean, at the same time, it's like what does then one do about this? And we can see we're not living in a stable form of capitalism. It's not like we have set horizons in which we can like organize and build up a struggle. We're living in a really weird
Yeah.
crisis plagued situation. And so
Well, I
but
think
yeah, we need a really radical labor movement. That's my 15, 20 years being in teachers unions. It's definitely taught me that we need something more radical in terms of our labor movement.
absolutely. Well, material conditions are always changing, right? But that does not necessarily mean the political solutions, in my mind. I mean, they need to shift with them. But the political solution, the baseline political solution, I mean, how you do it, how you go about it, yes, that changes. But what the political solution to me is it remains the same. Even if we're talking
Well,
of
so this has really, I would just say on this idea, one of the things that's been interesting to me in terms of solutions right now is this UBI stuff, which
why?
I must admit I have at times been skeptical about and whatever, but now you can see like actually it's a necessity.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, and a permanent UBI, I I mean, there's various left-wing arguments against it, but I don't see how
So I would see
that couldn't be yeah.
I would see a UBI as definitely something that would improve the material conditions of people's lives. Absolutely, no doubt about it. I also think that UBI is possibly the only way of saving the market system, not now, but 50 years from now, 100 years from now. You know what I'm saying? Because where we are today, we would never had this conversation in 1985 about like, will machines wipe everything? That's not that wouldn't be in our consciousness, right? So like where things are, when I described a 40-year process, it's 40, 50, 60, 70 the process that could take my entire lifetime, but it is moving away from the industrial economy. When I was a kid, there was an industrial economy. By the time I was 10 years old, when I was born, there was an industrial economy. When I or was dying, but it was there. By the time I was 10, I was told there's no more industrial economy, son. You're going to have to prepare for a service economy. By the time I'm an adult, they're telling me the service economy is going away. Or that by the time I'm an adult, I get into the service economy. I'm there for about 10 years. Now I'm told that's gone. Now we got to get in the gig economy. So this is going to keep moving from the and
Right.
so but I think that
And one of the things you're seeing there in your very clear narrative is that, in a way, capitalism getting stronger, making the conditions of employment worse and worse over time for the masses of people. And so that, in a way, it's still a ripe field for organizing workers.
Absolutely. So I think we'll seize the means no matter what they be.
Yeah.
And that doesn't change. That, we need to seize means of production. I mean, just,
Yeah.
whatever they may be.
Or somehow have a UBI and survive a pandemic. I mean, there's
So many
a UBI, survive a pandemic.
Yeah.
That's, I think people can get down with that.
Better than dying. Yeah. Beats dying. It beats dying. All right. So we're coming up on our
time, bro. Yeah.
Yeah.
I gotta roll. I gotta go. Let me
plug.
Roll out. Go ahead, Matt. What were you gonna say?
Make your final plugs. Tell people what to follow.
No, I just was gonna say it was great to talk to you. Always appreciate your perspective on the internet, and yeah. So just happy to do it again sometime.
All right. Talk soon.
Okay. Peace, bro.